Hello and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar on how to be an effective Select Committee Chair. I'm Lisa James, a Senior Research Fellow at the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing this discussion. Select committees are a vital part of Parliament. They play a key role in holding the government to account and informing debate. And last month, the 2024 Parliament elected its Select Committee chairs. Some already have experience in the role, but many will be taking up a committee chair for the first time. So in that context, we decided to take a closer look at this important role. How might Select Committee chairs tackle the job? And what makes them most effective? To discuss these questions, we've assembled a fantastic panel to share their experiences and the lessons they learned along the way. Our speakers are Joanna Cherry, SNP MP for Edinburgh South West from 2015 to 24, and from 2022 to 24, she chaired the Joint Committee on Human Rights. Margaret Hodge, Baroness Hodge, who was Labour MP for Barking from 1994 to 2024, and chair of the Public Accounts Committee from 2010 to 15. And Sir Charles Walker, who was Conservative MP for Broxbourne from 2005 to 2024. He was chair of the House of Commons Procedure Committee from 2012 to 19, chairing the committee through the bitter procedural battles of the Brexit years, and subsequently chaired the Commons Administration Committee from 2020 to 24. Each of the panelists will speak for around 5 minutes. After that, the four of us will have a brief panel discussion, and then we'll open up to audience questions. If you have a question, you can submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Tom Fleming will select from among them and put the questions to the panel. By default, he'll also share the questioner's name, but if you prefer, you can submit your question anonymously. And one thing you might want to consider when thinking about that choice is that this whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded. We'll be posting the video shortly afterward, and the event will also be available via the Constitution Unit podcast. So with the housekeeping done, let's get into the discussion. Joanna is going to kick us off. So Joanna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks to the Constitution Unit for inviting me to take part in this interesting session. I do think the Select Committees are one of the best things about the Westminster system, and I think other parliaments in these islands could learn from them. I think from my point of view, the most important thing to remember when you're a committee chair is to remember that your role as such is very different from being a backbench party political representative, or indeed from being a party spokesperson. And your role really is to assist cross-party parliamentarians to work together to scrutinise the government of the day effectively. And the good news for anyone watching who's a new committee chair is that help is available. When I was first elected chair, I sought advice about how to be a good chair, and there is coaching available through the parliamentary authorities, and I would highly recommend that coaching. But I also drew on my experience of watching how my predecessor, Harriet Harman, had worked. Of course, Harriet's a fantastic collaborative politician, very good at bringing people together. And I also drew on my experience as a former member of the Exiting the EU Select Committee, which was chaired so well by Hilary Benn that I really thought he ought to have been given the Nobel Peace Prize for the chairing of that committee. So I had good role models. The committee chair also needs to be a spokesperson for the committee, so that when reports are published, he or she has to be prepared to do interviews, to go on the Today programme, to talk about what the report's about. And again, it's a very different thing from going on the Today programme as a party political representative. And again, I had some media coaching about the different way to approach that. Similarly, when you're speaking in the chamber during a debate as a committee chair, you have to be very conscious, if you're speaking to a report, that you're putting forward the position of a cross-party report rather than your own views or the party political position, although it is possible to do both things in the same speech as long as you differentiate from speaking in your role as chair and your role as a party political member of parliament. So that's the first big point. It's a very different role from being a party political representative. Next point I want to make is that the chair must take the lead in setting the agenda for the committee, as well as chairing meetings. And that really involves three elements: planning ahead, selecting witnesses, and then the actual nuts and bolts of chairing the committee. So part of the role of the chair is working with the clerks and the support team to propose the forward programme. And this involves a fair amount of discussion and horizon scanning to see what issues are coming up. Now, it's the role of the chair to suggest a forward programme with the help of the support team, but then to discuss it with the committee and try to get the committee to agree that. Now, so far as the Joint Committee on Human Rights was concerned, there were certain things we absolutely had to do in our role as of scrutinising legislation, but there was also the opportunity to decide on freestanding inquiries. And I tried to do that in as collaborative a way as possible so that we would choose our inquiries by taking as many members of the committee with us on the idea as possible. And I'd really like to pause here to say how fantastic my support team were when I was chairing the committee. The clerks, the researchers, legal counsel, the media people, the logistics people, they were really all outstanding. And I can't speak highly enough of the House of Commons staff, and from time to time we'd also have people from the library seconded to us, and as always with the House of Commons library, they were great. Next role of the chair is to select witnesses to give evidence. And I felt it was really important that the committee didn't just hear from the usual suspects, that is to say, Westminster, London, or Oxbridge-based academics, think tanks, and NGOs. I pushed to make sure we heard from more diverse voices, both in terms of their geographical location and their standpoint. On the Joint Committee on Human Rights, as we navigated our way through some quite controversial legislation from a human rights point of view, Conservative members were very keen to make sure that we heard from lawyers and commentators who were perhaps more sceptical of the mainstream human rights agenda that I might have espoused as a left of centre politician. And I tried to facilitate this because I felt it was very important to make sure that the views of the Conservative members were respected in the previous Parliament, much as I might have disagreed with them. On the issue of chairing meetings, of course, the chair needs to hold the room, focus the issues, but also make sure that everyone who wants to ask a question gets to do so in meetings, and also to make sure that those who are quieter and less backwards, more backwards and coming forwards, are encouraged to feel able to do so. And one of the ways you can do that is by meeting with people one-on-one outside the context of the meeting to make sure that they are feeling comfortable, feel able to get involved in the way that's comfortable for them. You also have to make sure that no one person dominates the proceedings and that there's a fair allocation of time for questions. And I also felt it was very important to make sure that all members were courteous to witnesses. These people are coming to the Commons, or indeed the Lords when it's a joint committee, to assist Parliament. And I felt it was very important that people weren't rude to witnesses. Sometimes things could get a bit heated. As I indicated earlier, that happened frequently on the Brexit Select Committee. And the chair has to strive hard to try and calm things down and keep things professional. One of the issues we had on the Joint Committee on Human Rights towards the end of my chairpersonship was that in the past, we had generally managed to produce unanimous reports. I felt a little bit inadequate that under my chairpersonship, we had a couple of reports that weren't unanimous. But I think that was an inevitable function of the way of the previous government's agenda on human rights, which was perhaps not so respectful of international human rights norms as it had been previously. And again, there were some members of the committee who were signed up to that. And we tried very hard to have unanimous reports by moderating language and trying to bring everyone with us. And I'm actually very proud that on quite controversial issues like the Northern Ireland Legacy and Reconciliation Bill, the Strikes Minimum Service Bill, the proposals to repeal the Bill of Rights, the Human Rights, and replace it with the Bill of Rights Act, we managed unanimous reports. But on Rwanda, we just weren't able to do that. So a lot of background work went on trying to make sure that we could have unanimous reports, but we weren't always successful. Now, Lisa, I can see a look of concern in your face because I think I'm overshooting my time a little bit. So I think I'll just leave it there and then take questions later.
Thank you, Joanna. That's a fantastic introduction, and I think there's plenty to follow up on in the rest of our discussion. But for now, let's move on to Margaret.
Thanks, Lisa, and it's great actually. Before we came on onto the podcast, onto the webinar, we were all chatting to each other because I think we're three people who worked, respected each other, and I think the two people that I'm on with were really fantastic committee chairs. So it's a joy to be here today. I'm going to take a slightly different take on this, and it's quite interesting. I chaired the Public Accounts Committee, a different committee probably from the Human Rights one. I think the one takeaway I have is the importance for politicians of voice. I was a minister through most of the Blair Brown years, and I often used to feel, as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, that I had more influence and impact through voice than I did through the executive power that I had as a minister in those governments. I was never in the cabinet, but I was Minister of State for many, many years. And I think that's an interesting thing that chairs should think about, and members of the Select Committee. And it meant that I was quite often accused of grandstanding. And in a sense, I'd never apologized for that, because if you could use your voice to stimulate a debate or to bring attention to an issue which mattered to the public, I think that was effective use of that role as a backbench committee. So that's my first thing. And the other thing to say about that is, so often when we had witnesses, they hide behind their professional and technical jargon. And I couldn't tolerate that. So I always used to challenge the words they used to make sure that when they spoke to us in a language that everybody understood. I'd just come out of fighting the BNP in my own constituency, and I was very, very conscious of what the good burghers of Barking would want to hear us talk about and the language we'd want to use. That's the first thing. The second I think is really important in Parliament is the brilliant reforms that Tony Wright brought in that we all benefited from, which means that we were all elected. Before 2010, chairs of Select Committee, it was in the gift of the party leaders and the party whips. So you were tied to your political party. We were elected by all the MPs in Parliament. And that gave us a very, very valuable independence, which I think you need to nurture and use. And it also gave security of tenure. I always used to laughingly say, as a minister, you were certainly in the Blair Brown years, every summer you were scared you were going to be sacked or something was going to happen to you. When you're a chair of the Select Committee, you're there for the whole Parliament. And I think that independence is hugely important in the way you conduct yourself as chair of a committee. The third thing, slightly different, is I think we worked very hard to achieve consensus in the work we did. And I am proud that we produced in our 5 years 247 reports on all sorts of issues, and 246 of those were unanimous. And the only one that wasn't was the one finally just in the run-up to 2015 when we looked at the privatisation of Royal Mail. And that was just a little bit too political in the run-up to the general election for us to be able to obtain unanimity. And I think the chair has to seek consensus, because that makes it a much, 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 much more impactful way of working. So we worked as a team. As chair, I spent a lot of time talking to all my members, both individually and collectively. I did actually, again, a bit different from you, I didn't set the agenda. When we were talking about what we would look at in the future, we did that collectively, or I did it in my individual one-to-one meetings with members of the committee. And I think it's partly women chairing it, dare I say it. Apologies, Charles, but I think I had a style which hopefully built consensus. And I think the interesting thing is I was able to say sorry. So if every now and then I went a little bit too politically anti-conservative government and got reprimanded by my conservative members, I just said sorry and we moved on. But I think that was it is very, very important to do that. So that would be my third point. The next point, I always felt very much in the Select Committee, just coming out of Barking, that I was there to give voice to my constituents as well. So the questions that we asked, the issues we looked at, were all ones that we felt were important. We were important for our constituents. And the way we did that, the way I worked was very much we obviously have the National Audit Office, which is an incredibly powerful resource, providing us with data and evidence. But we went beyond that. So we used to talk to the NGOs. I mean, I remember when we looked at long-term care of people with disabilities, and people wanted to close the long-term. The voluntary sector really wanted those homes closed. It was the evidence from them that we took. And I can now admit, because it was very difficult, it's very controlled. The advice you get is very controlled by the officialdom in the House of Commons. And I can admit to having three wise men who were three very talented people I knew, who used to come in and have a croissant, a cup of coffee with me every Thursday morning when we'd reflect on how well we'd done in the past week and how we could plan forward. The other thing I feel that some of these select committees, and it's up to the chairs to do it, are very too formalized and too regimented. And we didn't run like that. So we didn't sort of we allocated topics more than questions. And if other members of the committee had something to contribute to that topic, we allowed them to come in. And I think that made for a better team effective questioning of the witnesses that we had. But I think that might be something we want to debate, and we may take a view on that. And the final two things, because I'm also conscious of time, is that the select committees, I think yours was a bit different, Joanna, but I think select committees follow departments. And all too often, we as MPs are absolutely fascinated by new policy challenges. That's what, we love looking at different policy challenges. Actually, what our constituents wants us to do is look at the effectiveness of what is happening now. And I think I always wished that actually the select committee spent more time monitoring departmental effectiveness, monitoring whether policies met the objective for which they were intended, rather than always looking forward at future things. And it's all this keeping your constituents in mind. And the very final thing, if you do want to have an impact, we're all in politics because we want to change the world and make a better place. And it's not just producing a report that will do that. It's following up and making sure that what comes out of the report really matters. We institutionalize that in the way that we worked as a select committee. But I often feel that, you often read these terrifically wonderful reports. They get 2 days of publicity, 2 days of coverage, maybe a few academics, dare I say, might follow it up, but they then get lost, and their impact is not brought into the system. So follow up, coming back to things is also very important.
Fantastic, thank you. And I can confirm that we at the Constitution Unit are big fans of reading select committee reports. No, that's really interesting, particularly reflections on different ways in which different committees might want to do things. And I'll hand over to Charles, who I'm sure will also have reflections on that point.
Well, thank you. I would like to start by saying that having chaired 2 select committees for the best part of 12 years, it was by far the most rewarding part of my political life. I think those viewing this discussion and hopefully participating in it later will see that there are 3 former select committee chairs here talking today who were committed to Parliament. And the lovely thing is that our time spent on select committees allows us to set aside our sort of more partisan personalities and embrace that huge amount of cooperation that goes across the House of Commons on a daily basis, and actually make that known to those following the work we did. Look, the things I would just say, and I don't want to go over the same ground as your 2 other esteemed guests, is that the joy of working with select committees, first and foremost, was working with House of Commons clerks, who really are some of the cleverest people you can come across. It's a bit like the dentist-doctor stream, and I'm not going to make any direct comparisons, but dentists and doctors start on the same courses and then sort of separate. Some become dentists, some become doctors. And I understand with the civil service fast track, that's the same. Some go into Whitehall, some become officers of the House of Commons, and they're not civil servants, they're officers of the House. And it was just a pleasure to work with them. I had 4 principal clerks, all of whom made my life. It was like driving a Rolls Royce. It was such a comfortable ride. They were experts, they were kind, they were thoughtful, they knew when to offer an opinion and when to hold back. So without great clerks, the select committee system really wouldn't work. And both as Joanna said, and I think Margaret said, without the library in support of the work that we do, again, it would have made life very difficult. Again, I'm just going to agree with your other panelists. I mean, the role of a select committee chair is, yes, to have some role in shaping the agenda, but also making sure all the members elected to the select committee feel that their interests are being followed and they have a chance to have things that matter to them looked at. I think my role really was not to speak as much as other members. I think if somebody did a bit of academic research and looked at evidence sessions on the procedure committee, they would find that perhaps I spoke well, some of the least amount, because that's not the role of a chair, as Joanna said, to monopolise the conversation. It's to make sure that all members of the select committee get a chance to take part in the discussions and ask the questions that they want to ask. It also makes me smile because you do get strong personalities on select committees, and you've got to be a pretty good manager in a very polite way, trying to cut colleagues short. It may not seem short to the audience. They may have had rather a long time, but colleagues' capacity to fill space, some colleagues, is almost limitless. So you had to be quite firm. And finally, I think you really had to understand the motivations of each and every one serving on your select committee, motivations that went beyond the party political. You had to become quite a good amateur, is it a psychologist or something? I'm just trying to understand the psychology of people so you could get the most out of them and they could get the most out of the select committee, because it's really important that people turn up to these select committees. And if you have a committee that isn't working, you will notice that people start drifting off, attendance rates drop. So actually having a good attendance rate, an above average attendance rate, tend to reflect positively on the chair of the select committee, because it gave the indication that people were actually enjoying being there and taking part. And I'll stop at that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Charles. I think that gives us lots to get into. I want to start just by coming back to the particular timing at which we're holding this event, because chairs have been elected, but the committees are not yet formally set up. It's now for parties to select the members of committees. They're doing that on a relatively long timeline. And so thinking about those chairs who are currently in place but are waiting for their committees formally to be established, do you think there are things that they could or should be doing at this point in time in order to plan for their committee, to set their inquiry programme up for success? Were there ways in which you use this time after election or wish you had in hindsight? I'll throw that to anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I don't think there was I think there is a real difficulty this time, from my understanding in talking to MPs, because there are so many Labour MPs. Those are all now, so it's extraordinary. Every single select committee, I think, has had an election for the Labour, certainly the Labour members. They've all been oversubscribed. Whereas, with the Conservatives on this time, there are not enough of them who want to come forward. So I think that is delaying a little bit. It's an interesting, I don't know what you do about it, but it's an interesting change of circumstance from the ones that we've faced before. I mean, I think in any job, I hope both Charles and Joanna would agree, you've got to get your head around the agenda that you're responsible for. So I would probably be using this period of time to look at past reports, to talk all the people involved, to all the advisors involved, to think a little bit about the first year's forward program so that you can get going with that. But this is unusual, this post-election period this time around.
Yes, yeah, and as various people have mentioned, there are lots of different options for the types of things that committees can do. You have lots of different sorts of inquiries. They can be very broad, they could be very focused, they can be quite long term, they can be one-off evidence sessions, they can look at new policy, they can look at ongoing delivery and implementation, they might pick up something that's already high profile, or they might try to shine a light on an under-recognized issue. But committees only have so much time, and they only have so much resource, excellent as that resource is. So how do you think about building a program of inquiries that might be able to balance those things? Is that possible, or do you have to just make some choices? Charles, go ahead.
Let me answer that because I have very little to say on it. So, because I was chairing House committees, procedure and administration, in the main, not entirely, we tended to be quite reactive to the situation at the time. So, for example, we did an inquiry into e-petitions. The number 10 petitions system was going to be brought into the House, and number 10 wanted to do that. And still maintaining some control over it. And I have to say, they lost all control over it because we pinched it off them. So that was very reactive in a sense that it needed to happen. Again, the EU sifting committee around sifting secondary legislation. I mean, that was precipitated, obviously, by the vote to withdraw from the European Union. So it wasn't like a departmental committee. I'll just stop at that.
Mm. Yes, Joanna, please.
So as Margaret indicated, the Joint Committee on Human Rights is a bit different from the select committees because it's a committee of 6 MPs and 6 peers, with a particular function of scrutinising government legislation for human rights implications. So what we used to do there was obviously have a look at the bills that were upcoming and pick out the ones that had the biggest implications for human rights, and focus on those. But we also carried out freestanding inquiries, and I would make suggestions about what they might be on, but I would very much listen to members of the committee to see what they thought they should be on, and we would have a discussion, sometimes a quite heated discussion as a committee. We might have a short list of 6 freestanding inquiries, but we could only do 2, and we'd discuss which 2 we would do. And just to give an example of the sort of thing we did, while Harriet was chair, we did a freestanding inquiry into the impact of forced adoptions in the United Kingdom between I think it was England and Wales. We focused on the same problem existed in Scotland, but it was for the Scottish Parliament. But forced adoptions in England and Wales between the 1940s and the 1970s, and the impact there on the human rights of the women who had their children taken away from them, and also the children who grew up without knowing their biological parents. Just on the issue of, to flip back to your previous question, just quickly on the issue of how people who've been elected might usefully use the time just now while they're waiting to see who's actually going to be on their committee, I would stress what I said earlier about the availability of coaching. That's something I spoke to my clerks about. And the House of Commons provided me with a coach, and it was absolutely fantastic. We just did 2 or 3 sessions, but I hope I was correct, that I learned a lot from it. And also watching really good past chairs, watching a couple of sessions from the committee that you're taking over in the last Parliament to see how its chair approached it.
I suppose the only thing I'd add, I don't think it's an either or in your questions, Lisa. I mean, we were very different from the other 2 select committees. So if some item broke in the news that we thought demonstrated a challenge to the way public expenditure was being used, we would jump on it quickly. And we had 2 evidence. I mean, we worked incredibly hard. We had 2 evidence sessions a week, and we were producing at least 1 or 2 reports a week. I mean, ours were short, sharp reports. So, and there's a lot to be said for that, because you can bring some immediate accountability to an issue that you lose. But equally, I'm a great advocate for looking at existing programs and how departments are delivering well. I mean, I had been a member. In fact, I chaired the Education Select Committee in '97 when Labour first came into government. And that we had 1 session a year in those days where we would look at the budget, and I just felt really there wasn't enough focus on how well we were using existing resources and how well they were meeting existing policy objectives. I always wished, even with my PAC hat on, that some of the other departmental select committees did more than that. And then, of course, you want the long-term ones. Of course, you want the long-term ones looking at, tricky issues, long-term issues, difficult policy issues where you can add value. So I think it's an all and, if one's very ambitious. It's hard. I think my fellow ex-chairs would agree. It's hard work being a committee chair. It's not, it really does absorb a lot of time.
You have to become a great negotiator, Margaret, normally with various whips offices.
Well, speaking of some of those relationships, first of all, I should just remind the audience to please send in your questions via the Q&A. I see we have some coming in already, but do keep them coming because we'll be moving on to those in due course. One thing I'm curious about is what you think select committee impact looks like, and what thoughts you had on what you wanted your committee to achieve, and how you measured whether or not you've been able to do that. There's one very obvious way which academics often look at, which is to look at your recommendations and whether those are taken up by government. But of course, select committees play lots of other roles, including informing debate, informing backbenchers. Did you have views on coming into the role on what you wanted your committee to achieve and how you wanted to go about that impact? Yes, Joanna.
Well, one of the things we did in the Joint Committee on Human Rights was to suggest amendments to bills. So, say, for example, we produced a report to take recent legislation on the Illegal Migration Bill, Illegal Migration Act bill as it was then. We were quite critical. It was a unanimous report. We were critical of aspects of the bill, and we proposed a number of amendments. Unfortunately, Conservative members didn't feel they could get behind the proposals for amendments. But that was something that we did that I feel did have impact, because we would table the amendments. I would speak to them. And quite often I would table them with somebody else, or Harriet would table them with me when I was Harriet's deputy. And then we would see people piling in from other parties to support them. And they would very much inform the way that the debate went forward and the scrutiny on the bill. I just want to take this opportunity to say this about the impact, and I really agreed with what Margaret said about the importance of the reforms that took place, and the fact that the chairs are elected and that the chairs are independent, and the very good point about security of tenure. In the Scottish Parliament, the chairs of the select committees are not elected. They're appointed by the whips. And we do have some people who are quite independent minded, but often we don't have people who are terribly independent minded. And I know there's a lot of people working on looking at reforms to the Scottish Parliament now that it's its 25th anniversary, and I would really like to see it emulate the Westminster model with the elected chair and the proper independent scrutiny of government by a chair who is not beholden to the government, or indeed necessarily his or her political party in any way.
Great, thank you. Margaret, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, when I first took up the role, there was an IPPR report on the effectiveness of select committees, and I read that, and it said of the Public Accounts Committee, they never changed the price of fish. And I was just determined that we should change the price of fish. So, I mean, how successful were we? I don't know, because I now read select committee PPAC reports that go back very much with similar recommendations to the ones we met. But what we institutionalized was twice a year, we would look at the reports that we'd done in the past, and we'd look at the recommendations, and we'd see the ones that were implemented and not implemented. And then we would bring back for an evidence session those permanent secretaries where we felt they should have implemented recommendations that they hadn't. Did that have an impact? Maybe you need to look at that and tell me. But it didn't have as great an impact as I would have wanted when I started determined to change the price for fish. But there were things equally, I can look back at things. That's why I said in a funny way, and I so agree with Charles, I think being the chair of a select committee is the most privileged job you can do in Parliament and the most satisfying job. There were things we changed, and I often thought it was easier to do that than it was to get it up through the bureaucracy of decision-making in government, which is for another day, but is incredibly difficult to have that impact there.
Charles, did you want to come in?
Just briefly, I mean, in preparation for today's discussion, I look back at some of the work my two select committees did, and like Joe does and Margaret, I take great pride. Select committees tend to be chaired by motivated people who want to get stuff done. In fact, most people in politics, not all, but most, are motivated and want to get stuff done. So, for example, the House of Commons Petitions Committee, we basically wrangled that, pinched it off number 10. I think the House of Commons Petitions Committee and the way the public can engage and get debates in Westminster Hall and governmental response has been a really important development in parliamentary democracy. If you want to get really technical, the EU withdrawal bill, there were eight backbench amendments to the EU withdrawal bill in 2018, of which 7 came from the procedure committee. So out of the 8 backbench amendments, successful backbench amendments, 7 came from the procedure select committee. And the final thing I would say, and we can perhaps discuss this in questions, looking at my 2 esteemed colleagues, there is an attempt at the moment to somewhat undermine select committees, not by government, by people I think who should know better, who say that the right reforms to make select committees an alternative career path are rightly being eroded away, and select committees are much better chaired. And this is no criticism of Margaret, but much better chaired by people who've been former ministers because they understand things that humble backbenchers don't understand or are too thick to understand. And I think it's absolutely essential that select committees also offer an opportunity for parliamentary-minded backbenchers to have a really, really productive and important career. And I would hate to get to a point where most select committee chairs are won, and it's entirely down to members who they vote for, are won by former high-flying cabinet ministers who end up becoming select committee chairs for the same scrutinising a department they may have left only 3 or 4 weeks earlier. I just think that's wrong. Now, my colleagues need to think that's wrong to stop it from happening, but it would be a shame if select committees stop providing a route for backbenchers to have a really rewarding parliamentary career, making a really big contribution to public life.
And I note for our podcast listeners that there is plenty of nodding among the panel to this point. I mean, we've referred quite a lot to the relationship with government, but the relationship between select committee and government is obviously conditioned by both sides, and perhaps it sometimes seems that different governments may be more or less disposed to listen to committee advice. How did you as chairs navigate that relationship? How did you think about the best ways to influence, and particularly as Joanna referred to, on some quite difficult and sometimes quite emotive topics?
I mean, I used to certainly have meetings in the day with various. It was the coalition government and then the Conservative government, with various cabinet ministers to discuss the work that we were doing and the findings that we had established and the recommendations. So I think relationships is always key to politics, and I think having that was helpful. I think we made more civil service reform. If I take that as an issue, I mean, he wasn't the most popular reformer of civil service, but he was radical and committed. Francis Maud. I worked with quite a lot on civil servant accountability. I mean, we had this crazy thing when I first came in, that a permanent secretary would move on to another permanent secretary role and then cease to be responsible for the stuff they'd done when they were permanent secretary. It was just daft. So you had somebody else coming in and saying, I know the last one did it all wrong, but it wasn't, not me, Gov. And you really, if you wanted to build strong accountability, you needed the person. So we changed those sorts of things. And I also met with Danny Alexander at the time, who was Chief Secretary, the Liberal Democrat Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And we did quite a lot of work together around tax avoidance and when we were sort of doing the Google, Starbucks, Amazon sort of things. So I think personal relationships matter. And thinking right back to when I was Education Select Committee Chair in 97, we worked there very closely with David Blunkett, who was the new Secretary of State, and we would look at things and try to persuade him and them and the PermSec that what we were saying they might have a bit of regard to that.
Lisa, you're on mute.
Sorry, somebody had to do it. I was saying, Joanna, perhaps I could bring you on this. I'd be interested in your reflections on this.
Well, I mean, obviously there were some very difficult and emotive topics in the time I was chair of the Joint Committee, and also towards the end of Harriet's tenure. While Harriet was still chair, we had the difficult and emotive issue of the proposals to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace them with a Bill of Rights. And I think one of the reasons that we were able to be so influential on this was that we managed, through careful diplomacy and bringing everyone with us, to produce a unanimous report. And our unanimous report, which said the Human Rights Act is working well, we don't need to get rid of it and replace it with a British Bill of Rights, reflected the findings of the independent review of the Human Rights Act and the majority of views in civic society. So I suppose a select committee building alliances or working not so much together, but working alongside other independent reviews, such as with the Human Rights Act and other commentators, was a very effective way to influence government. And I think, my experience of politics, and I would agree with both my fellow panelists, that being a committee chair was the most rewarding thing I did in Parliament, considerably more rewarding than being a spokesperson for the third party, because I feel that we did influence and change things on the Joint Committee on Human Rights in a way that sadly my party didn't really succeed in doing terribly well when we were the third party. So I feel that, I feel the way you really change things in politics is by working cross-party and by building coalitions with other parties and also with civic society. And I think that's why the Joint Committee on Human Rights was very influential in persuading the government to think again about their plans to the previous government to get rid of the Human Rights Act, because of that collaborative working and because we managed to produce a unanimous report. In order to do that, some of us, myself and Labour members and Lib Dem members, maybe had to pull our punches slightly to bring the Conservatives with us, but it still had the desired result. So it was worth pulling our punches slightly.
Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had some spectacular failures. Meg Russell, who I believe is on this call, will know that we had 2 attempts when I was chair of the procedure committee to reform private members' bills. And I read through the government response to our second go in 2015, 2016, and it's basically just a big fat middle finger to the committee. I mean, there's not even any effort to sugar it. And I think we came up against a lot of conservatives, small C conservatives, both working in our whip's office, working in Whitehall, and potentially in the Labour whip's offices as well. There was no appetite to reform private members' bills, so that was a disappointment. And I think this might make Joanna smile. The other area where we did get a report through was English votes for English laws. And it was the only select committee report I did where there was a division. We had 2 Scottish members of the SNP on our committee who quite understandably voted against it. But I need to be honest, I never really understood English votes for English laws. I don't think anybody in the government did. I think there were about 2 people in the entire Westminster bubble that understood evil. I think I know who one of them is, but I never knew who the second one was. And we were asked as a select committee to do this because we were the procedure committee. They wanted a framework for doing it. And I think in hindsight, probably I just should have said at the end, I'm sorry, we don't really understand it. We're not going to do it. It's the only regret I have. I think English votes for English laws was really not a good thing. Not a good thing.
Speaking of Meg Russell, I'm just putting a link in the chat to some work that the unit has done, authored by Meg, on the impact of select committees. She reminds me also that I should be pointing people toward Margaret's book, which is an excellent read on the experience of being a select committee chair, among many other things. Now we've I just wanted to pick up on Joanna's mention of civic society, because we've talked quite a lot about relationships, on the committee, with staff, within Parliament and into government. But of course, select committees have also got far broader relationships, including with civil society, with business organisations or groups, and of course with the media. And so I wondered whether you'd like to say something about what you found were the key relationships, how you got the most out of them, and how you went about building those as well. Yes, Joanna, go ahead.
I'll just come in quickly there to mention something that Harriet did as chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, which I thought was really fantastic, was that she tried to bring in panels of people with lived experience on inquiries that we were involved in. So, for example, on our inquiry into the human rights of asylum seekers, we heard from people who had actually travelled from places like Eritrea or Afghanistan to the United Kingdom as an asylum seeker, what their journey had been like, whether they knew where they were going, how their relationship with people smugglers had been, etc., etc. And that was really important to inform our debate and our scrutiny of government policy. Likewise, when we were carrying out the freestanding inquiry into the human rights of women who were forced to give their children up for adoption, Harriet held workshops where we met lots of women who had that experience. And each of us on the committee sat at a table with a number of women who'd had that experience. And I think there were some also children who had, grown up children who'd found themselves in that position. And it was profoundly affecting hearing their personal stories. But also, it really informed our inquiry and made us all understand why it was so important to see this as a human rights issue. So just before the election was called, I was looking into ways that we could do that in relation to other inquiries with my team before the election was called, and I lost my seat. But I think that was a really important innovation of Harriet's, and I thought it was wonderful.
Right, Margaret, would you care to come in on that?
Yeah, I so agree with what Joanna's just said. We did a lot of work, and NGOs, civil society organizations, commercial organizations used to write to me and contact me to say, could they come and talk to me about an issue that they cared about, where they thought the Public Accounts Committee could have a role. And we always listened, and we did respond. And we did a report, we did an inquiry looking into at the early years expenditure and agenda, and that was stimulated by civil society representations. I talked earlier about looking at the long-term care of children with disabilities in care homes, and that was stimulated by civil society. I want to say something about the press, because I think again, my work was slightly different from those of my two colleagues. We did. I think I was one of the few people in Parliament who used to have a good word to say about the press, because we did do a lot of work with investigative journalists who would bring stuff to me, and then we would use that. I mean, if you think of the Panama, again, on the tax area, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, that was all investigative work done by journalists that came to us. And also sometimes we would stimulate be in the middle of an inquiry, stimulate something that the journalists then ran away with. I remember when we were looking at the privatization of the welfare to work. This is a little bit of a long story, but I will tell it. The privatization of the welfare to work support. So they took it was entirely private. It was one of Chris Brayling's early ministerial jobs, and I experienced it in my constituency. I found that we had a company there who had taken over from two very, very good voluntary organizations that used to provide, one a church-based, another a disability-based organization that used to provide the welfare to work. They'd come in, they took a slice of 10% off the top, and I don't think they added any value, and I was furious because it meant there were fewer frontline people supporting applicants, supporting claimants. Came back to the office, looked up about this company, and found that the woman who was running it had paid herself an £8 million dividend on the back of all the public sector contracts that she'd got. Yeah, Joanna's going, whoa. So we used that, came out in a committee session, and the press went bananas on it and did a whole lot of investigation on that company and other of the welfare providers, which provided further sessions for us in which we were really able to go underneath what this privatization had meant in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. So I have a good word to say about those many, many investigative journalists who don't just depend on the worst gossip in the Westminster bubble, but do care about sort of delving into the public sector and whether it's supporting society.
And Charles, can I bring you in, last but not least?
So when I was chair of the procedure committee, the press weren't too interested in procedure. They became a little more interested around the time of Brexit. It was normally the government whip's office that were interested in what we were up to. And I remember there were these two shadowy characters who used to sit at the back of the room in my early years, and I called them the princelings of darkness. It was only years later that I realised they were two house officers who were probably reporting back to Sir Roy Stone, the government's business manager in the whip's office. But they were two of the most charming, lovely people and grew to be good friends. And we were all with laughter at the time, because I just had no idea who they were. I just think they were sent there to stop whatever I wanted to do. And then as chairman of the administration committee, it's important to just be absolutely clear with your viewers today that I was elected by the committee. That's one of the few that you're not elected by the House. The press was slightly interested in what we did, particularly around the pricing of food, because they were obsessed with MPs subsidising food and getting subsidised food. And I always used to enjoy pointing out in the chamber that there were 360 press pass holders who were also enjoying that food, just to dampen their ardour a bit. And the only time I got on the wrong side of the press, we did a report about how we could assist members of Parliament leave Parliament in a good way. And I think there should be something to commemorate your time there, a medallion or something like that presented by the Speaker. And I think the Daily Star said, now the numpties, or it might have been ruder than that, want a medal. And there was a picture of my head on a flower pot or something on the front page of a newspaper, which, yeah, so look, the media is the media, but they focused on the medallion. They didn't focus on the more substantive part of the report as a result of that. But final point, as chair of the administration committee, actually, we did quite a lot to help the press report Parliament. At one point, the press gallery, as you may know, was behind a cage, a locked cage. One of the access points and entry points was locked. So if there'd been a fire, there would have been some terrible things happen to them. So we kept a beady eye out for the interests of the press, because the press are important when it comes to reporting Parliament.
Fantastic. That brings me neatly on to the next and final thing I wanted to ask you. So this is my final call to the audience to please send in your questions via the Q&A function. We'll be coming to you very soon. But Charles, you've mentioned on the administration committee wanting to open up the work of Parliament. Joanna mentioned the importance of bringing in lived experience and inquiries and engaging with the public in that way. What role do you think select committees can play, or what should chairs be thinking about in communicating the work of Parliament and the work that they're doing outward to the public, as well as within the institution and within Whitehall and Westminster? Margaret, you nodded, so I'll come to you first.
Demute myself. I think it's hugely important. I think I said that in my opening remarks. I came to that job having just spent 4 years campaigning against the British National Party in my constituency. And that really, really influenced the way I did my politics. So I just passionately believe that, your voice should be the voice on behalf of the burghers who put you into your position. I just believe that very much. And that was why the way we asked questions and the way we try to encourage a public debate on the issues that we considered in our committee was really important to me. And I mean, one of the things that I'm most proud of, on tax, when we started on tax, nobody thought about tax. It was all too technical. It was something for the professionals. It wasn't for us. And because we debunked it, in the evidence sessions that we did on it, it then became And we all pay our taxes. So tax belongs to all of us and we should all have a say in it. And I think by debunking it, we stimulated a debate so that it became something people talked about in the pub or around the dinner table. And I'm proud of that because I think that is really important in what we should be about. What we should be about. And too much of what we've always done in Westminster is you get locked into the bubble and you forget why you're there and who put you there.
Great, thank you. And Charles, can I bring you in?
I don't think I've got much to add to that. I think to be a really good select committee chair, I think you're getting a flavour of it from all of us. You've got to be pretty fearless as well. You've got to do what you think is right, and you've got to point the committee in the direction where it needs to be pointed, and there should be no off-limit areas. And you can't be bullied off a subject. And I bet if you look at Joanna and you look at Margaret, there were times where people put pressure on them, be it the media, be it, I don't know, be it ministers, I don't know, colleagues. You've just got to go where you think you need to go when you're a select committee chair.
You're on mute again, Lisa.
I'm so sorry. So Joanna, let me come to you finally on this question of communicating with the public through select committees and communicating Parliament's work to the public, and then we're going to go to audience questions just after that.
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, I used to get asked from time to time as chair to give lectures, but that was usually in a university context, so maybe not with the public. I suppose one of the ways of doing it was when one was invited on to various programs like the Today programme to discuss a report, to try and explain in clear language what our concerns were about bills that the government were proposing, and also to take the opportunity when one was invited on just as a backbench MP to things like any questions or question time, to talk about the work of the committee and to talk about the importance of cross-party collaboration in scrutinising government. Because, you know, I suppose I said at the beginning, I think or earlier on, I think the select committee system is one of the best things about Westminster. You know, we do tend to find the first past the post system can create governments with huge majorities like the current one, and like Boris Johnson's government although that got kind of whittled away, didn't it? But I think when you have a government with a big majority and a government that's come in like the current government with a lot of new backbench MPs who might be inclined to be quite malleable at first because they obviously understandably want their careers to advance in their party and in Parliament, then the role of select committees becomes particularly important in scrutinising the government.
Great, thank you. And let me now bring Tom back on screen and we will hear some questions from the audience. Yes. Tom, what do you have for us?
All right, thanks, Lisa. So the first question we've got is from Joe Farnworth, who is a rep from an anti-poverty charity, and says that they've seen the value select committees have had in getting the government to think again. So Joe asks, what are things that panellists value when external experts or charities seek to build relationships with you as committee chairs, and what should be avoided? In a slightly similar vein, Anya Sizer works for Compassion in Politics and has been doing work on improving public engagement, where they think select committees are a vital bridge. So Anya asks, how can we keep on reinforcing this and also widening that public engagement to people who maybe wouldn't always get involved with politics? And then the last question, which is an anonymous question, is about whether the panellists think that chairs and committees currently have the powers they need to do their jobs, in particular to get evidence and get people to come and appear in front of them.
Fantastic, thank you, Tom. So we have what select committee chairs want and need from external experts and civil society, how select committees act as a vital bridge on public engagement, and whether chairs and select committees have all the powers they need. Joanna, can I come to you first on those?
Yeah, in relation to what we want and need from experts in civil society, What was immensely helpful was, of course, as well as the people who were asked to come and give oral evidence, were the people who submitted written evidence, and that would be organisations such as the one Joe represents, but also academics, think tanks, and also individuals. Many private individuals would write in with their views, and all of those were carefully looked at. So that was really immensely helpful. On the question, I think I've dealt with the question of public engagement already. On the question of whether we had the powers we need, I think I might leave that to one of the select committee chairs. Of course, I was chair of a joint committee, because I seem to recall that there were issues in the previous parliament, perhaps the one before, about people refusing to come when they'd been asked to come and give evidence. But I think maybe Charles or Margaret might be better able to deal with the answer on that one.
Charles, would you care to pick that up?
I think we're going to give this pass to Margaret in the end. I don't know whether it's a hospital pass or not. So because we were a House committee, procedure and administration, we didn't encounter the problem that Joanna's identified too often. I mean, the great power we had in procedure was the power to embarrass. So one of our responsibilities was checking up on written ministerial responses to parliamentary questions, and we published league tables, and there were some shocking performers who fell outside all the agreed matrix for answering questions within a certain amount of time. And I remember once we had a junior minister come before us, and her performance was utterly shocking. I mean, utterly shocking. And we wrote to her Secretary of State, who was then Michael Gove, saying this is just not on. We were treated in a dismissive fashion, and literally he turned up the next week and gave a bravura performance. So I think there is, he could have said get lost, but actually if you don't turn up at a select committee, you can be embarrassed, and people don't like to lose face and be embarrassed. And I think that's one of the most powerful, that's one of the most powerful tools at our disposal, to be perfectly honest. Because if people don't turn up, they tend to get named and shamed in the press, and people don't like that.
Margaret, the hospital pass is yours.
I'm just on the role of the NGO sector. I think evidence, giving evidence, a good select committee chair will want to hear evidence from other sources than the brilliant ones they get from within Parliament, but you want to hear all voices. So I think it's evidence, information, is hugely important. On the issues of the powers, this is quite funny. I don't know if the other two know this, but in the past, if somebody refused to come and give evidence to a select committee, we nearly did it once, you could take the matter to Parliament. And if Parliament then passes a sort of motion of, condemning this, the offending individual can then be locked in a little prison that there is up in Big Ben's Tower for them to reflect on their bad behavior and not appearing in front of a select committee, and maybe coming before us. We never had to use that power, but I think there ought to be. It's a difficult one to do. I did have some instances. I had to write to one permanent secretary 3 times before she agreed to come. She'd left the department. It's one of those instances where she'd been responsible for a policy. It was all to do about European agricultural subsidies. Terrible mess we'd got into, and we'd lost a lot of European money because of it. And she'd moved to another department, and she said, I'm therefore not responsible for coming to the select committee. I wrote to her 3 times, and in the end she came. So a little bit of determination, and it's easier with internal people. We were also taking external evidence from external people, and that's much more difficult. So, but I think, and the only other thing is, I would want better access sometimes to papers, because when we were looking, for example, at the aircraft carriers, which was an ongoing saga. And when the coalition government first came in, they changed the specification for those carriers. And that was an incredibly wasteful exercise. It ran into billions. And they wouldn't release the papers to enable us to see how that decision had been taken and what advice and information they'd got. And I remember Andrew Tari and I wrote in at that point to David Cameron. Andrew Tari chaired the Treasury Select Committee. We wrote a joint letter, and finally those papers were released. But I think access to papers is very, very important, and I would like to see that extended and put to practice. The final thing is, I've always been against hearing people on oath, although we did put somebody on oath once, because I think the moment you bring that into a select committee, it becomes too legalistic, too like a courtroom. And one of the reasons select committees work well is the less formal sort of environment in which I think there's greater honesty and openness. So some people want that, witnesses to give evidence and oath. I've always opposed that.
Joanna, I spotted a hand.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to come back in there. I just wanted to check my facts before I said this to make sure I had them right. Yeah, during the passage of the illegal migration bill through Parliament, we wanted the Home Secretary, who at that time was Suella Braverman, to come and give evidence to the committee because she'd signed a Section 19 declaration under the Human Rights Act saying that she wasn't able to certify that it was compatible. And effectively, she didn't do so, and she didn't respond to correspondence very timelessly and was not very cooperative, and the bill was going through very quickly. So what I did, as well as writing backwards and forwards, as Margaret's explained, was I raised a point of order in the chamber. Got a bit of a mealy-mouthed response, and I don't think she ever did give us evidence. But we sometimes had an issue with that, with ministers wanting to avoid us. But generally speaking, they eventually came. But on that issue, on that one occasion, the Home Secretary didn't come to the committee, which I thought was disgraceful.
You should have locked her up, you see, in the tower at Big Ben.
Well, much as I disapprove of detention without trial, I wish I'd known about that at the time.
Tom, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I think we've just got time for a small handful of last questions. So there's one from Paul Evans, who highlights that the Joint Committee on Human Rights was unusually bicameral, and so asks if Joanna feels that the cultures of the two houses reinforced each other on that committee or conflicted, and should there be more joint committees? And then an anonymous attendee asks, are select committee chairing skills generic and transferable across different types of committees? And related to that, how important is expertise in the committee's subject matter or policy area?
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, for our last 5 minutes, two quite big questions, but Joanna, let's come to you first on that question about bicameral committees.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, before I became a member of Parliament in 2015, I was somebody who was very critical of the House of Lords. And whilst I believe that the United Kingdom should have a second chamber, indeed, I'd like to see an independent Scotland have a second chamber, I think that there should be some degree of accountability, democratic accountability in a second chamber. Having said that, I came to greatly respect the work that many peers do, very careful, measured, detailed scrutiny, and drawing often on considerable expertise in previous lives, not just as a member of Parliament, but also people from legal backgrounds and all sorts of other backgrounds who really brought their expertise to bear. So I actually really enjoyed being a chair of a joint committee. And I think it might be good to have more joint committees, but I must caveat that by saying that much as I admire the work done by the House of Lords and many individual peers, I still remain of the view that the second chamber should be in some way accountable to the electorate.
Right. And Margaret, can I bring you in on the question of generic and transferable skills versus subject matter knowledge?
I don't think, let me say, I think chairing and getting the consensus that we've all talked about, those are all transferable skills. And, just knowing how to bring people together, I think that's transferable. And you can pick up a subject. I mean, all you've got to do is give yourself time and make sure you speak to all your stakeholders before you embark on it too vigorously. But I mean, one of the joys of being a member of Parliament is that you learn about things I never thought I'd ever learn about. Tax. I mean, it never crossed my mind that I'd sort of develop an interest in tax or illicit wealth or money laundering or all these things that I've sort of learned about. And that's actually one of the joys and privileges of our jobs as MPs, is that you expand your horizons. So I'm all for picking up new subjects. Give yourself time to get on top of it.
Charles, please.
I look. I mean, I looked into all the reports and work I did in advance of this discussion today. The longer I did it for, the better I got. The more I got out of it, and maybe there's a lesson there. As we know, we have a sort of revolving doors for ministers. They're in departments for 8 months, 9 months, 15, 16 months. I think, yeah, when you really get to understand a subject area, as the three of us did over many years, you just get better and better at it. And of course, the skills you acquire as a chair are transferable to other committees, as I did when I transferred to administration. But undoubtedly, my performance improved each year of the 7 years I chaired the procedure committee, because I just knew it more. I knew the people, I could manage people better, I understood the subject area better, I understood what motivated governments and civil servants and advisors better. So it was a hugely formative experience being a select committee chair. And again, I'm going to agree with your two other panelists, absolutely the highlight of my parliamentary career, not just my parliamentary career, my career up to this point as a 57-year-old person. Just amazing.
Wonderful. We could very easily keep going, but we're coming up to 2:15, and so I think I'd better draw this to a close. But very, very many thanks again to our speakers for this really interesting discussion. And thank you to Tom for fielding the questions. And of course, thank you to everybody on the call for joining us. You'll soon be able to find a video of this session on the unit's website and YouTube channel. And the audio version will be released as an episode on our podcast, so do point others toward it. And join us too for our next event. On the 4th of November, we will be discussing how to be an effective opposition with Baroness Kate Fall, Professor Mark Steers, and Dr. Nigel Fletcher. You can sign up on our website, and the link has just appeared in the chat. But for now, that's it from us. Goodbye. We hope to see you again soon.